We now come to the debate on permitted development and shale gas exploration, and I call We're a Hobhouse to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I first of all ask the Backbench Committee for allowing time for this very important debate. I'm honoured to be able to lead this important debate and would like to thank all colleagues as well from across the House who have turned up to come and contribute, although we had a rather long and difficult week behind us. This debate follows from two oversubscribed Westminster Hall debates. Last October, the government consultations on giving shale gas exploration permitted development rights and classifying sites under the National Significant Infrastructure regime came to an end. The government has yet to publish its responses to these consultations, but instead it is choosing to push it into the long grass. However, the first two Westminster Hall debates on this subject made one thing very clear: Parliament has a view and would like to be heard. These proposed measures give shale gas exploration permitted development rights and classify sites under the National Significant Infrastructure regime are a bad idea for many reasons, and I will just focus on two central points. Firstly, giving fracking companies access to permitted development rights under the mantle of nationally significant infrastructure deprives local communities of a voice. And secondly, even more fundamentally, fracked fuel is a fossil fuel. To support the new development of any fossil fuel is a travesty, given that the threat of global warming should urge us all to have a complete rethink of how we produce our energy.
Would the Honourable Lady on that point?
I'm very happy to give way.
Very pleased that she's got this debate, and I congratulate the way she started it. Would she agree that the context to which the government is encouraging fracking is bad enough, but then the way in which it's treated renewables and made it so difficult through the planning process and just the way in which the subsidy regime has been completely cut away, it means that our renewables now are at standstill? It's a disgrace.
I couldn't agree more, and we have got such an important and long way to go to actually become carbon zero. What is this government doing? Promoting fracked fossil fuel over renewables. We are living through a global climate crisis. I'm very happy to give way.
Very grateful, and congratulations on bringing forward this very important debate. She said earlier in her remarks this was a new fossil fuel industry or sector, I think she said, but is it not right that shale gas would simply displace imports rather than creating an additional demand on gas-fired power generation?
I have been in this fracking debate for a long time. Since 2014 I've been debating this, and actually to just say it's a little bit less of a fossil fuel than the gas that we are exporting is a wrong argument. It is a fossil fuel. It contributes to global warming. We should not explore these old-fashioned ideas about how we produce our energy. But I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to her. I completely agree with her that we should not be opening up a new front on fossil fuel and increasing the contribution to climate change. She's absolutely right about that. But on the issues of planning, my local authority has now twice voted overwhelmingly against fracking in nearby West Lancashire, which affects my constituency as well, and their views are completely ignored by the approach the government is taking place. Doesn't this demonstrate that there are significant local interests that should be taken on board? It cannot just be a national government issue around permitted development rights.
So there are two very big wrongs here. A, it's a fossil fuel industry that we shouldn't support, and B, we are overriding local communities and their voices to be heard. And I feel for your communities in East Lancashire and the way they've been treated. It's an absolute, it's wrong. It's just simply wrong. And as somebody who used to be a local councillor, I cannot agree more with how wrong it is if local councils and local communities are not being heard. happy to give way.
Very grateful and congratulate her for the powerful speech that she's making. On that point of community engagement, does she recall the former Conservative minister saying fracking could take place, and I quote, in the desolate north? This is not good enough. My constituents in Barnsley East don't want fracking, and community should be listened to.
Hear, hear, well said.
Well, absolutely, and also to classify different regions of our country in those ways is appalling. And I'm happy to give way.
The Honourable Lady and my neighbour giving way. I'm very much enjoying her comments. But for balance, could you remind the House which country is top of the league table in the G20 for decarbonisation?
I believe this country has actually made great strides. We were leaders, but we are falling behind very badly if we don't keep up this lead. And that is really what worries me, and that is where things have gone very badly wrong in the last 3 years. We are living through a global climate crisis. We must align our policies to become carbon zero before 2050. And I'm sure the government has listened to the IPCC report. I have been campaigning against fracking since 2014. In Bath, not only is there a concern about global warming, there is also a concern that fracking would interfere with our hot springs, causing unknown damage to the water table, to our unique geology and the natural springs, which are the very reason for Bath's existence and prosperity throughout its rich history. There are additional concerns about the wider environmental damage, such as earth tremors and gas leaks, as well as the huge water consumption required for the process. I don't know whether people have read the recent reports about the problem about water shortages. If we are encouraging an industry that wastes water in such a way, what are we doing not listening to all the environmental concerns that are being raised throughout? Well, I have to make progress, but I give way for a last time. Yep.
The point I was making earlier is about displacement. We use gas anyway. This isn't about more gas, it's whether we import it or produce it. There are 23 million homes in the UK that are connected to the mains gas network. Can I ask, is her home one of those properties?
My home is heated through an energy centre, a community energy centre. These are new ways of trying to address. Yeah. But where the gas is coming from is obviously what we are talking about. How this gas is produced that we are using. And I am talking about that fracked gas is a fossil fuel, and there are renewable gas alternatives that we need to explore and into which we should invest our money. And the government should give priority to those. I'm happy to give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I commend her for bringing this debate before the House. Just on that point there specifically, I do appreciate the point that the honourable member is trying to make, but what's happening is we're building an unprecedented number of houses right now in this last few years. 18,000 just in Warwick and Leamington. They will all have gas boilers. They did not need to have. They could have had air source heat pumps, for example, to heat the properties.
So I completely agree with the honourable member that actually to get to carbon zero is a massive challenge, and we must start today, and particularly thinking about how actually our new houses should be built, because the retrofitting of all these properties will cost even more money. So everybody, through all departments, we need to really put our mind to it. I must make some progress now. These problems are not unique to Bath or the UK. We know from the United States that fracking operations can result in the contamination of the water table. The effect of this is wide-ranging, meaning people cannot even drink their own tap water and risk their health in the process of that. A report produced in 2016 by the United States Environmental Protection Agency demonstrated exactly how the hydraulic fracturing fluid used to split the bedrock can contaminate groundwater as well as releasing gases displaced by it. Communities across the USA have been forced to try and mitigate these problems. We should not even go there. Why should we risk water contamination? To add to all of this is the amount of industrial infrastructure that will scar our countryside if these proposals are pushed through. Giving permitted development rights to shale gas exploration would effectively remove the control which local authorities would usually have over the planning process, and it's already been mentioned. Yes, I give way again.
On building infrastructure around these sites, does she not think it's slightly hypocritical that CDC, the development arm which invests in infrastructure outside of Britain, government-backed development bank, would not invest in shale gas because of the infrastructure, because of the climate change risks, but for some reason we're happy to do it in our own country.
Well, I would certainly agree that there's a lot of hypocrisy around this issue. I remember in my old authority where a wind farm was built over the communities of Greater Manchester, people were talking about the infrastructure that was built just for accessing the hills in order to actually put up the wind turbines. That was a terrible thing. Fracking platforms need to move around all the time. The infrastructure that we need to build for that is absolutely incredible, and I don't think people have ever put their minds to that. But yes, there's a lot of hypocrisy.
Will she give way again? Just very briefly. Is she aware, she probably is, that satellite data for over the United States shows that 5% of the methane from fracking is leaked through fugitive emissions? And because methane is 85 times more powerful than CO2 for global warming, it makes fracking nearly twice as bad as coal for global warming. So would you agree that under no conditions should we go ahead with fracking?
Well, I certainly agree that we haven't really got comparative data, and fracking is hailed as this sort of new thing that would actually reduce global warming, and it absolutely doesn't. It means local people, local communities are being removed from the decision-making process, and that's one of my biggest concerns today as well. This particular issue was picked up by the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee report. It concludes, I quote, "Shale gas development of any type should not be classed as permitted development. Given the contentious nature of fracking, local communities should be able to have a say in whether this type of development takes place, particularly as concerns about the construction, locations and cumulative impacts of drill parts are yet to be assuaged by the government." Since I really have to get on now. Since the government proposals were announced, 300,000 people have signed petitions against these proposals and 40 councils have passed motions to reject them. With such widespread opposition, giving fracking companies access to permitted development rights would not simply speed up the process, it would serve to muzzle opposition, effectively silencing local communities. This is outrageous, and I hope that colleagues across the House will join me in voicing their strongest opposition. The Constitution would look to making larger fracking sites part of the national significant infrastructure regime is also entirely incoherent and frankly dangerous. According again to the Select Committee report, there is no precedent for this classification. Shale gas extraction sites fail to meet the criteria which normally determine nationally significant infrastructure. The report suggests that this would undermine the ideas of which nationally significant infrastructure was founded, and it would damage the relationship between fracking companies and the communities they are placed within. Combined with permitted development rights, it adds to the government's callous attempt to take the decision-making process away from local communities. Shale gas exploration and extraction would be a decision for private companies and the government, bypassing those who are most impacted by it. Madam Deputy Speaker, turning now to the climate crisis. The big problem we face is the government's energy strategy and our continued reliance upon fossil fuels. Fracking is not sustainable, and even classifying it as a transitional fossil fuel doesn't stand up to the science. It recently emerged that investing in fracking would produce as many carbon emissions as 300 million new cars. It is blatantly obvious that the Tory government favours fracking over renewable energy. The Environmental Audit Committee found that investment in renewable energy had fallen, and the honourable member can reply later, had fallen by 56% in 2017, which was the greatest decline of any country that year.
Exactly right.
In May 2018, investment in renewables has been at its lowest in 10 years, despite the claims by the government that renewable energy is booming. And that must be wrong if we now have and urgently must turn our attention to become carbon zero before 2050. The recently released IPCC report states that globally we must become carbon zero by 2050 if we are to limit global temperatures rises by 1.5 degrees. Scientists have concluded that temperature rise, which is higher than that, will bring irreversible damage. In order to prevent this from happening, the IPCC report gives us 12 years to completely transition away from fossil fuels. 12 years. With the proximity of that deadline, how can this government argue that now is the time to be rushing into a massive national project of shale gas production? My view, a view I hope will be shared with others in this House, would be they absolutely should not. We must reinvest in renewable energy. This government has removed subsidies for onshore wind and has spearheaded a 65% cut in subsidies for household solar panels. The 2017 budget ruled out additional investment in renewables before 2025. Yet communities up and down the countries are asking for more investment into renewables. Only a few weeks ago, our streets were filled with school children who were making their voices heard and saying that the climate crisis is the biggest issue for them. We need a culture change urgently, and all government departments should have sustainability and a carbon zero target at their core. As a developed country, we should lead the fight against climate chaos, but this government has gone in completely the opposite direction. Policies such as those proposed by the government stand in the way of progress. This government cannot keep prioritising big oil over the urgent need to combat climate chaos. The government has to drop these proposals. As a country, we must legislate in a way that restricts fossil fuels industries and invests instead heavily into renewable energy. There is no time to lose, and we owe it to ourselves and future generations. Thank you, Madame Deputy.
The House will be aware that there are a great many people who wish to speak this afternoon. We have limited time, so we will have a time limit immediately of 5 minutes. Mr. Mark Mingus.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chairman. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's a great privilege to be able to speak in a debate of such significant importance to my constituency, and I would like to thank the Honourable Lady opposite for applying to the Backbench Business Committee. It follows in the path of a similar debate that I held in the end of last year at Westminster Hall, and that debate too was heavily oversubscribed. So I will focus my comments on one or two significant areas. I was elected in 2010, and at the point of my election, it then became very clear that there was shale gas activity, or at that time it was just gas activity, taking place in my constituency. And I think I would just urge caution on the party opposite. Before you make this something very political, it was the actions of the last Labour government that delivered shale gas to my constituency. And I would also say to the Liberal Democrats, it was a huge privilege to actually work in the department, in my case as Parliamentary Private Secretary, to the then Secretary of State who is in his place today. Because actually much of that work that was done in terms of putting in traffic lights and putting in some of that regulatory framework was work that should have been done by Labour when in government before they gave the green light to proceed with shale gas and proceed with fracking. But none of that work was done. I'll happily give way.
Honourable Gentleman for giving way and for making those points. I hope he can confirm that in those years we allowed local democracy to function. I opposed people who were arguing for permitted development. I opposed the idea that this should be some sort of national infrastructure project. And we put on, after vast consultation, the very strict regulation with respect to seismicity, and we had his support. Will he continue with that support?
Which is why I called the Westminster Hall debate last year, which is why I'm on my feet today. I think it is let me just make some progress. I think it's absolutely critical that permitted development, which has a place in our planning system, is for the small extension to a bungalow, for a conservatory, not for an enormous industrial estate which will produce tens of thousands of tonnes of pollutants, which will have thousands of vehicle movements per year, and so on and so forth. I'll take this opportunity, Madam Deputy Speaker, to thank the Minister and to thank the Department for listening to the case that myself and local people put with regards to the Roscoe Wood site. Because that was a site in my constituency which had been long running, had gone through a number of stages of the planning process, including 2 planning inquiries. But we made the case that that site was unsuitable, primarily because it was up country lanes and where the traffic management plan, regardless of how you tried to cut it, simply did not work. And under permitted development, in what was being proposed, traffic management plans, I'm not sure where they fit in. So a fundamental reason why a site was turned down would not be part of the consideration under permitted development. And that, if you're looking for any reason, Minister, as to why this proposal doesn't stack up, just refer to Roscoe Wood and the decision tree that kicked in, because you turned it down on those grounds, and therefore, with permitted development, you simply cannot proceed. I'll happily give way.
I'm most grateful to him for giving way. Looking at the present government, they have a policy of localism and wish to see devolution increased. If the government are being consistent, does he not agree with me on this issue? They should let local communities decide.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, and I think the Minister has a difficult decision here, in that the planning system for shale gas simply cannot continue as it currently does. Because Lancashire County Council and the various appeals, etc., etc. I mean, for Preston New Road and I think for Roscoe Woods, we've been counting in the years the planning process and going on. And that is something which is not good for local communities that has this hanging over them, nor does it favour local democracy, because the powerful can hire the lawyers and can basically game the system in order to suit them. And so I think the planning system in its current format must change. It needs review. But permitted development is not the route to go down. And on the issue of local democracy, I would say again, a lot of nonsense is talked when it comes to Lancashire County Council, that Lancashire turned this down, but ministers forced this on them. I think that the reality was that planning officers in Lancashire County Council came to Preston New Road, recommended on planning law grounds that Preston New Road should go ahead. And I would also say to those people who were complaining about the Secretary of State giving Preston New Road permission to proceed, you cannot then celebrate the fact when the same process through a Secretary of State then refuses Roscoe Wood. The planning system sometimes gives you what you want, it sometimes gives you the opposite of what you want. So I'm afraid you cannot trim your argument to suit your case. I'll happily give way. Yeah.
I think my honourable friend's making a really important point here, but just back to the potential changes in permitted developments, would he not agree that if that went through, that could have a detrimental impact on undermining public trust in our planning system?
No, absolutely for sure, and time is against me, so with the permission of the House I will not give way again. But I think it is really important that the Secretary of State bears in mind the concerns raised by local communities, the concerns that have been put forward by members such as myself, that we work together in a constructive way to ensure that permitted development is, quite frankly, taken off the table, because it is not a sensible route to go down. But the planning system is reformed in a way that ensures consistent and transparent opportunities for input from local communities, that it does not drag on for years, creating a shadow over parts of our countryside, and that we give some planning guidelines as to what could look like a suitable site and what sites, quite frankly, people shouldn't even waste their breath considering. I want to see a situation where we do move towards renewables providing the overwhelming majority of our electricity output alongside contribution from nuclear. And until we get some movements on battery technology and other forms of the next stage of renewables, gas will play a part. So on the cold day in February, when wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, gas doesn't play a part. But shale gas can only play a part if we can say hand on heart that it is done safely, that it has got robust regulation, and that it is taking communities with them and not something that is being done to them. So I would call on government to continue with the work that has been done, to let's celebrate the huge amount of positive change that has taken place as a result of listening to concerns from members such as myself, but to make sure that when it comes to the end of it, that permitted development is not a tool that the shale gas industry can deploy as part of a planning process. Thank you.
Sir Mark Hendrick.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I came to this subject originally 10 years as a neutral. A neutral because I have a scientific and engineering background, and I'm usually driven on decisions like this, on issues like this, by the evidence rather than necessarily any political or ideological reasons. And I deeply believe that we need a very varied energy mix for this country. Obviously as much renewable as possible, I still think nuclear power has an important role to play, because nuclear power nowadays is much safer than it was in the past. And I think in a very unstable world where we still need carbon fuels, where we have producers like Russia, countries around the Middle East and North Africa producing oil and gas, I think it's very important that we have our own indigenous carbon fuels that we can turn to as and when we need to. And therefore I was quite agnostic when it came to the development of shale gas production in Lancashire. Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the House of Commons for producing an excellent paper on the 6th of November on shale gas and fracking, because it's provided a great deal of background and insight into the issue. But the issue until fairly recently hinged around exploratory development in Lancashire. And if I can look back in the past to what's happened in Lancashire, on the 1st of April 2011, getting on for 9 years ago, Blackpool, not far from my constituency in Preston, experienced a seismicity, or a tremor, of 2.3 on the Richter scale, which was far too hot, far too large. Since then, on the 27th of May 2011, again, nearly 9 years ago, a subsequent tremor of 1.5 on the Richter scale again. Now, we were told that it was due to fluid injection into a fault zone, and that the fracking company Quadrilla had already mapped out parts of Lancashire, and they knew exactly where these fault lines were, and therefore that should never occur again. Yeah, of course.
My honourable friend is making a passionate speech, and as a fellow Lancashire MP, I'm sure he hears from his constituents as well about their concerns about earth tremors and earthquakes caused by fracking. Now, in response, of course, the government brought in a traffic light warning system. Many of my constituents are concerned that that traffic light warning system is maintained and stays in place despite the pressure from some fracking companies. Do his constituents tell him the same?
Yeah, I thank my honourable friend for her contribution, and my constituents do feel the same, and that's why I've risen today to speak on this important subject, because obviously the City of Preston is very close to these fracking sites. If I can move on, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government insisted that controls are in place so that operators will have access to the location of faults before fracking, monitor seismic activity in real time, and stop if a magnitude greater than 0.5 on the Richter scale is detected. 0.5 was the figure that was promised throughout the time that the developers were going through the exploratory phase and the development phase before they turned to production in Lancashire. And it's good to see the Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton in his place, who was Secretary of State at the time, because I do recall being present in his office when he made a great number of assurances about how fracking would be conducted in Lancashire, and of course things have turned out rather different than what he said at the time. He was, of course, Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change between 2012 and 2015. And to The Guardian, he made a statement along the following lines, saying that I wanted to make sure that we have tough regulations to tackle things like methane emissions and any pollution, to make sure that we've got things like water sustainability right. He went on to say, if we're going to do fracking, we've got to make sure that it does not hurt our environment and local communities benefiting from it. Now, we've yet to see local communities benefit from it. And you know, as with coal, the people in the north dug the coal. It was the people in the south and around London who made the profits from that. I don't want to see the same happen with fracking. And indeed, local communities have been subjected since then to much higher levels of seismic activity. If we look in November 2018, there were something like 30 recorded events of seismic activity over a 2-week period with a 1.1 magnitude tremor. Now, that is twice the levels that were indicated by the former Secretary of State or the government at the time or Quadrilla themselves. Now, the people of Lancashire have had enough of this. I came to this as an agnostic, as somebody who wanted to believe that 0.5 was a level that Quadrilla were going to stick to, and unfortunately that's not been the case. And since then, of course, Brian Bapty, head of seismology at the British Geological Survey, has now told journalists at a briefing in 2019 that, sorry, I've got no time, the limit could safely be raised to magnitude 1.5 since this was a similar level to vibrations caused by a heavy bin lorry. Well, I'm sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is not what was promised. And indeed, then since then, we've seen a Times letter of February the 9th, 2019, from 50 geoscientists saying that we should increase it even higher. It's not acceptable, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the people of Lancashire are not willing to accept this.
Nick Herbert.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The House will know that I represent the most beautiful constituency in England, Arundel and South Downs. 250 square miles of Sussex countryside, no large towns, only small villages and small market towns, half of it in protected landscape, the South Downs National Park. Nevertheless, there is oil extraction in my constituency, and it is entirely uncontroversial. There are small oil wells, and I have never received any complaint about them. There is regular visit, I assume, by oil tankers to take the oil off the site, but they are located sensibly, and as a result, the public does not get excited about them. In my neighbour's constituency of Chichester, there is in fact such a well in the national park itself. Similarly uncontroversial because it's located near a main road, not near a community. And public interest in the proposed fracking in West Sussex takes two forms. There is the concern about the below-the-ground activity that comes from some. Will this activity, for instance, have an impact on local water sources? And then there is the concern about the above-the-ground activity. What will the exploratory drilling and then any potential drilling mean in terms of future traffic movements that will affect neighbourhoods? And my experience is that when proposals have been made where communities get particularly exercised, it is because of their fear that the countryside in which they live is about to become industrialised, and that what are otherwise quiet country lanes and quiet villages will suddenly find that they have very significant lorry movements through them, not just in the exploratory period, but potentially afterwards if large sources are discovered. It fell on West Sussex County Council as the responsible local authority to assess whether one proposal near Wisborough Green, a beautiful village in my constituency, for exploratory drilling was appropriate. And the County Council looked at the proposed traffic movements down very narrow lanes and was very unhappy about the impact of them. And in fact, ultimately the Council, taking no view on the merits of fracking or drilling otherwise, not having a policy of animus against the extraction of the mineral, nevertheless thought that the lorry movements were inappropriate. And I think they were rightly reflecting the concerns of the local community. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Is making an excellent speech. It's not just at the drilling sites where traffic is a concern. The Nostrop treatment works in Leeds, one of only 3 places that's licensed to treat fracking wastewater, and that wastewater would discharge into the River Aire. So there's concern there about traffic movement and about discharge into local rivers. So it's not just at the drilling site, but also at treatment works.
The honourable gentleman makes an interesting point. There are, of course, environmental objections that are wider, and those might be addressed separately by the suitability, the strength of the regulation of this activity. But my concern is whether it is appropriate for exploratory drilling and then potentially subsequent extraction of shale gas should be allowed by permitted development. Now, I am not an opponent in principle of permitted development rights. I think that it is appropriate sometimes for those rights to be applied. I am a supporter of those rights being applied for the conversion of office buildings to residential premises, because I think that has produced a large amount of housing that would not have happened otherwise. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Member for giving way. The Conservative Party manifesto, the 2017 general election, actually spoke about a revolution in shale gas and spoke about liberalising the planning regime. That's a manifesto, of course, that Conservative members stood on.
The gentleman is entirely right. There were many other manifesto proposals that we stood on that have not seen the light of day. And I would gently suggest to my honourable friend, the Minister, my very good friend and near neighbour, the Minister, that this would be one proposal that it would be wise to keep in the bottom drawer, firmly locked away. I do not think that it is wise to allow this activity to be put under the permitted permitted rights regime. I don't think that's an appropriate use of this planning procedure, because I think it is appropriate for local authorities to be able to assess what is the impact of things like traffic movements on an activity in their area. And yes, you can put conditions on permitted development. That is not the same as having it looked at by the local authority. Of course, all of these things are a question of balance. But one thing that I would say is that I have discovered in 14 years as the Member of Parliament for this beautiful constituency in West Sussex that there is no uncontroversial, no non-controversial way of generating energy in our country. Yes, we all want more solar, but large-scale solar panels in beautiful countryside can excite just as much opposition as, for instance, drilling activity can. And the question is whether activity is located appropriately. And I think that some of the proposals that have been made in my constituency have been for inappropriate locations that have not thought through what the impact on local communities would be, and others are uncontroversial because they have been more sensibly located. So I do not have an in-principle objection to the extraction of oil or gas. I'm not entering into the debate about the merits of fracking in particular. It's likely that there will actually only be oil in my part of West Sussex and not gas anyway, I think, but I may be wrong about that. But I do know that there is concern about the potential random industrialisation of the countryside. And what we can't do is just allow that by one tick in a ministerial box and then find that there is absolutely no control over that whatsoever subsequently, except in the protected areas of the national park. There has to be the ability of local authorities to take a view about the impact of things like traffic movements and decide whether the levels are appropriate, and potentially to be able to put conditions on it. And that's why I think we should retain the existing planning regime for this activity, and why I would, I repeat, strongly suggest to the Minister that this is not a proportionate or sensible policy that he should pursue.
We have to reduce the time limit to 4 minutes. Sir Edward Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I refer the House to my entry in the Register, particularly with respect to solar power and community energy renewables? Madam Deputy Speaker, when I was Secretary of State and having to deal with these issues, there were people in the coalition who thought that shale gas was the answer to everything, that would reduce energy prices, and were extremely keen to push it forward. I was not one of those. I was helped in my far more cautious approach by colleagues like the Honourable Gentleman for Fylde and others on the Conservative benches, who realised we had to be extremely cautious about the environmental issues and also the local planning issues. And one of the reasons why I'm very proud of my honourable friend, the member for Bath, for calling this debate is I am concerned that what was agreed in the coalition with respect to being very strong on local democracy and very strong on risks like seismicity, those controls are in danger of being taken away. And I was very concerned that this relatively new industry had to be safely regulated, both for the environment and to take account of local issues. When we looked particularly on seismicity, Madam Deputy Speaker, we took advice from the experts. We had evidence from the Royal Society, the Royal Academy of Engineering, looking at what would be the right approach on the regulation for seismicity. We consulted widely. The report that they gave to me, I published and asked people's opinions on, so we took a cautious approach even about the evidence. And I came to the view and accepted the recommendation that the traffic light system was the way to go, that we needed a precautionary approach, not least because the geologists and experts were telling us that even a small seismic event underground could damage the casing of the wells, the boreholes, of the fracks. And so I accepted we needed to be very cautious. It was important to give that reassurance to the public, and we decided that we would go ahead, but only on that explicitly cautious basis. In the ministerial statement I gave in December 2012, setting out that cautious regulatory regime, I did say that in due course, maybe that could be looked at again. But for the benefit of the House, let me be really clear on what we were saying at that time. We wanted a significant amount of evidence. It had to be evidence-based. And so far, we've had very few fracking experiences in this country. Very few. So we do not have anywhere near the number of data points and evidence that we could possibly, we would need to possibly allow anything to go further forward.
Just quickly on that point, would he agree with me that it's very interesting to compare the government's planning approach to fracking and to the planning approach that they take on renewable energy?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point. If the government proceed in this way of allowing permitted development, it will be in sharp contrast to their planning approaches with onshore wind. I had battles, almost weekly battles, with the then Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, who was trying to stop onshore wind. We won most of them, but after the 2015 election, they made it almost impossible to build onshore wind in England and Wales. That sort of very negative approach to renewables stands in stark contrast to what they appear to want to do with respect to fracking. And I would bring that to the House's attention, because I think it's completely the wrong priorities, not least because of the climate change crisis. If anything, I have got more sceptical about fracking over the years, because the evidence, particularly after Paris, is that we need to be even more rigorous in reducing our fossil fuel usage. Now we've gone from a 2-degree target to a 1.5-degree target. We have got to push the renewable agenda further forward. And I would say to the Minister, when we were thinking about shale gas, we were thinking about making sure it was linked to technologies like carbon capture and storage, which frankly are now in abeyance. And without CCS, there's much less argument for fracked gas. Moreover, technology for renewables has increased dramatically, improved dramatically. Prices have come down much further. We've seen storage technology come on. We're not going to need the gas that people thought we were going to need just a few years ago. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the relaxation of regulations, whether on seismicity or on planning, is completely unjustified. And I hope this House will send a very clear message to the ministers. But I would go even further. Given we've had such progress in renewables and storage, the case for fracking gas is much, much weaker than it was just a few years ago. And I would urge the government to rethink their priorities. Let us bank and capitalise on the amazing success of these new green technologies. Let's not look backwards.
TP.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Congratulate the honourable member for Bath on opening today's debate. I agree with much of what she said. I, too, oppose fracking for two reasons. Firstly, because it poses a threat to my constituency and I object to it being there. And secondly, because I just don't see the case from an energy policy perspective for why it should be required. But there is an important distinction to make, which my honourable friend was trying to introduce the honourable lady during her speech, and that is that we shouldn't conflate fracking, where we get the gas from, with the role of gas in our energy system in the interim. And I understand what the Honourable Lady said about sort of methane leakage and the potency of that as a greenhouse gas. I absolutely understand the point that she was making. But fundamentally, the decision over whether or not to go big on fracking now in the UK is an immediate decision. It's a planning decision, an energy policy decision, and I think there's a very clear argument against. But if we conflate that immediacy with the more measured approach that we need to take to removing gas from our energy system, I think that risks diluting what is a very important debate. Now, the reason I don't think that fracking has any role in our future energy mix is firstly because we have, as a consequence of the decisions that the Chancellor took over decommissioning costs in the North Sea, we've seen a resurgence in North Sea oil and gas exploration, which is helpful in meeting the UK's domestic needs in the short term. And so I think all of the expected economic upside will no longer be realised. Add to that the rapidly decreasing costs of renewables and storage, and the very exciting opportunity to embrace hydrogen, which I would far rather see be the mainstay of the government's future gas policy. And I think you can start to make a very compelling case for not requiring fracking, whatever the safety arguments might be about it. There is just simply no role for it in the UK's future energy mix. But there is an interim role for gas. And I commend to her and to all other members in the House the work that I've been doing with her colleague, the Right Honourable Gentleman for Orkney and Shetland, and the Shadow Minister, the Honourable Gentleman for Southampton Test, on the future of the gas grid. Because there's a real opportunity to be introducing low-carbon gases into the natural gas mix within our gas system immediately in order to start to decarbonise, particularly, that would have a profound impact on the decarbonisation of heat. And of course, the longer-term goal is the arrival of a hydrogen-based gas system which would meet the needs for decarbonising heat and also have, I think, a very exciting role in transport, and also would have a very exciting role in terms of interseasonal long-term energy storage. The other thing that I think very interesting, the Right Honourable Gentleman for Kingston and Surbiton mentioned in his speech carbon capture and storage. And I think the real opportunity with hydrogen, particularly when you look at pre-combustion carbon capture and storage technologies, is that actually instead of CCS being something that you spend £1 billion a time on to do in itself, if you link it to the production of hydrogen and the emergence of a hydrogen economy, then the CCS becomes more affordable because it's part of that whole package, and I think that that's a very exciting proposal too. So I just hope that the government can admit that what might have seemed like a good idea 5 years or so ago is no longer a good idea. The world has moved on, and there are many, many, much more exciting opportunities that we could be embracing if we can just ditch fracking.
Louise Hay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a great pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's a reason the government are considering bypassing local authorities entirely and removing the need for planning permission with fracking. It is because fracking has little or no support within our communities. Ministers have, I'm afraid, been hypnotised by the success story in the United States without considering the critical difference between the US and the UK, and that is that the US has vast tracts of low-density land which it can exploit. For fracking to be a viable part of our energy mix in the UK, two things are necessary: tracts of land with low population and broad-based community support, but we have neither. The Bowland Shale gas field, by far the most sizeable in the UK, is where the viability of fracking will live or die. It covers land from Lancaster in the north, Sheffield in the south and Whitby in the north-east. One well, just one, has been introduced in this basin in teeth of opposition, and even that has lain dormant for many months due to tremors. And it covers almost all of the major metropolitan centres of the north of England: Liverpool, Manchester, Preston, and on the right side of the Pennines, Derby, Sheffield, York and North Leeds. It is an absurdity that the government think a fracking basin that covers a population running into the many millions is viable. And rather than recognise these inherent flaws caused by trying to impose an industry with a dubious environmental record on a highly populated sweep of land, the government instead are trying to override the local population entirely. If communities cannot exercise their democratic right to oppose fracking through the planning system, then how can this government maintain the presence of localism? There is no broad consent for fracking in the way that there often is for other users of the national infrastructure projects regime.
Will my honourable friend actually acknowledge that it was the elected members on Lancashire County Council who voted not to have fracking at Preston New Road, and it's the government who turned their back on those people, my constituents? So all these nods to localism, actually what the government is saying is localism and local opinion is well and truly buried.
Absolutely right. There can be no pretence to localism when the government is riding roughshod over the voices and rights of local authorities and local people, not least because of the documented seismicity risks. Since just October last year, the Preston New Road operation has triggered 3 red-level tremors and 57 earthquakes, not to mention the risk to aquifers. Denying the local community a meaningful say is utterly anti-democratic and perverse. It is not too late for the government to rethink their approach and recognise that the obstacles they are finding in their way should not just be bulldozed through inappropriate legislation, and that at a fundamental level, the prospects for an advanced shale gas industry in the UK are completely and utterly flawed.
I'm now introducing a 3-minute time limit in order to make sure we get everybody in. Lee Rowley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak today. It's a pleasure to follow my near neighbour in Sheffield in this important debate, and it's also a pleasure to see so many people who've been involved in this discussion ever since I joined the place, particularly in my capacity as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the impact of shale gas, and I congratulate the Backbench Business Committee on selecting this and the honourable member from Bath for doing so. This is an incredibly important debate. And already we've had fantastic contributions on this side of the House, and in fairness on the other side of the House as well, on this. I think what you are seeing here is that there is an emergence of a cross-party consensus here that we have a problem on fracking in our country. If there was a traffic light system to be applied today to this House, it would be flashing red that there is no majority for permitted development NSIP, or probably even pursuing fracking in general in this country. I say that not because I am an anti-fracker per se. I didn't start in that place. I used to be, my second job just before I left after I left university, was as an oil and gas analyst for 3 years. So I came at this, like others in this debate, from an agnostic perspective. But the problem with fracking is when that you unpick it, and when you unpick the economic prospectus upon which it is based, as my honourable friend from Wells indicated a moment ago, it falls apart. And if I, as a pro-business conservative, as somebody who believes in trying to fix our energy solution, as somebody who believes that we cannot move straight to renewables, however laudable that may be, but if the prospectus upon which we are talking does not work, then at some point you have to practically and pragmatically say we should go no further, we should invest our personal energies and our money and our capital and our effort in something else. And that is why I am convinced that fracking does not have a place in the future energy mix of the United Kingdom, and the government should abandon it. It is wasting time. There are 3 problems with it. One is a people problem. The fracking has now increased in terms of the knowledge that people out there have. As that knowledge has increased, support for fracking has decreased. And the problem now is that there is a perception that the system is being pranged. The system is being pranged because of the NSIP and the PD proposals, which are being suggested by the government at the moment, that you can get this in the same way as building a kitchen extension, and also that the fracking companies have come and asked for changes.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Happily give way.
Would he agree with me that this has got to be more organic, and that if people want this, it should come from the ground up rather than the top down?
I completely agree with my old friend. We've absolutely got to give local communities their own say. The community I represent in Marsh Lane has been clear that it does not want this proposal. It should not be forced upon them. It should not be compelled that they take the 14,000 lorry movements over the next 5 years just to explore. It should not be required that the light industrial estate that is going to be plonked in the Greenbelt, largely unchanged for the last 200 years, will be necessary for a village of 800 people. And I'm going to read into the record again, in the time I've got left, the actual bulk that is going to be there for 5 years. 5 years. A perimeter 2-metre high fence, an additional 4.8-metre high combination of bunding and fencing, 2 to 3 cabins of up to 3 metre height, acoustic screenings of up to 5 metres in height, up to 4 security cameras of 5.5 metres in height, a lighting rig of 9 metres height, a 2.9 metre high power generator, 2 water tanks of up to 3 metre height, a 10 metre high emergency vent, a 4.5 metre high Cooney pressure controller, a 4 metre high blowout preventer, skid and choke manifold, and for 6 months, a 60 metre high rig. That is in the middle of Greenbelt. That is next to a field which was rejected just a few years before for a car boot sale for 14 days of the year, but we can stick a light industrial estate in the field next door. Fracking does not work for this country, practically, economically, or from a land...
Order. Thank Debonair.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the member for North East Derbyshire, clearly arguing for his own community very well. Madam Deputy Speaker, I recently said in this chamber that I wanted to be able to look the next generation of Debonairs in the eye when they're 18 and say that I had fulfilled on my promise for us to stop climate change, for us to be the generation of policymakers that actually halted it and even managed to reverse it. But we're not going to do that unless we stop taking new fossil fuel sources out of the ground and we invest instead in renewables. So Bristol has declared a climate change emergency, and local communities in my constituency of Bristol West are taking part in many different initiatives to do their part, but local communities can only do so much, and we need national leadership. So I really would like the government to consider following Bristol's lead and the lead of many other local councils around the country and declaring a national climate and environment emergency, as Labour has done earlier today, and take the policy actions that are needed. And this includes stopping fracking. In 2015, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government declared that there would be no fracking in national parks and sites of special scientific interests. But I did, in fact, sit on a delegated legislation committee. Oh, goodness, the thrill of those DLs. But in this particular case, members opposite were suddenly shocked to realise that my honourable friend, the member for Southampton Test, was pointing out that this delegated legislation committee was about to pass a regulation allowing fracking under national parks and SSSIs in certain circumstances. The most they were able to muster was an abstention, but we voted against it. But this is not what we were led to believe when the infrastructure bill passed through Parliament in 2015. The public and members were led to believe that there would be no permitted fracking under national parks and sites of special scientific interest. So as well as the argument about climate change, there's an argument about protecting the countryside. But most of all for me, it's an argument about climate change. I want this to be the generation of politicians who declared that national climate emergency, an international climate emergency, and put that into every single one of our policies, made sure that every single decision we take is thinking, how will this either contribute to or mitigate against climate change? The young people I met outside in Parliament Square 3 weeks ago, and in my own constituency on other climate strike demonstrations and in schools, they want us to do that. They want us to stop fracking. They want us to invest in carbon neutral technologies. They want us to be that world leader that I know that we can be, and I urge the government to follow their lead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My comments centre around the need for gas. I'm on a slightly different page from other people who I've heard in this debate. I think we will need gas. It's a question whether we import it or produce it. And in my view, it's much better to produce it than import it for for many reasons, including the environmental benefits of producing rather than importing. But I must say I am against, as the Minister knows, permitted development rights and nationally significant infrastructure project status for shale gas exploration. The need is clear. We import half our gas today. It will be up to 70% by 2030. Increasingly, that's from all over the world, including Russia, principally from Norway, but including Russia. 23 million homes. Gas might have a long-term future. Carbon capture and storage and the H21 programme that's in Leeds, where we're converting methane, or going to convert methane into hydrogen, means that gas may, even in a zero-carbon future by 2050, which I'm supporting and wrote to the Prime Minister on that basis, gas can still play a part in that future. Of course, I am concerned about how it affects my constituency. That's the reason I went to Pennsylvania, a self-funded trip, to look at the infrastructure in Pennsylvania, met with protesters and producers and regulators. I saw from Pennsylvania you can do it badly or you can do it well. It is compatible with the landscape if it's planned properly. That's why I helped North Yorkshire, our County Council, produce a minerals and waste plan that had clear guidelines about protection, surface protection in protected areas, of course, no fracking surface activity in national parks and AOMB, but also restrictions on proliferation, a maximum of 10 well pads per 100 square kilometres. That is, some people think that's a lot, some people think that's not very much, but in my constituency, I've got conventional gas extraction. There are 3 well pads in my constituency that operate on that density, and most people in my constituency don't even know those well pads are there. Yes, in the short term, as my honourable friend from North East Derbyshire pointed out, there is industrial activity. When that goes away, you can come to Kirby Minister and see it. You'll see a clump of trees. That's all you will see of a fracked well pad. So people should be at least cognizant of the reality of shale gas exploration. There are some issues that need solving. We need to make sure we have a proper government-backed remediation plan. It's not fair that landowners would pick up the tab if this goes wrong in the longer term, in the likely event. And also we need to do more in terms of local communities benefiting directly from the disturbance and the nuisance. There is no doubt, and they should benefit for that directly into household pockets, in my view. Just to conclude, Madam Speaker, I'm against NSIP and PDR. It's the wrong thing to do. The Select Committee said that quite clearly. The government should withdraw its plans to push ahead with that kind of exploration.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And follow on that from the member of the Select Committee, the honourable member for Thirsk and Malton. And we did a Select Committee report, not looking at the fracking, whether it was good or bad per se, but whether the planning guidance on fracking was right, and whether local communities had any real say and could address the impact on their communities through the planning system. We concluded, as everyone just said, that the proposals on NSIP and permitted development were totally wrong. They're completely contrary to the localism agenda that the government set out on in the Localism Act, where the then Secretary of State talked about a groundbreaking shift in power to councils and communities. It appears that's gone into reverse in terms of these proposals. In coming out against the proposal on permitted development, the committee said that the contentious nature of fracking has already been demonstrated by a number of speakers, and the impact on local communities should allow them to be able to have a say in whether this type of development takes place. I think that's fundamental. Communities should not be excluded from that process. Indeed, it's very different, isn't it not, Madam Deputy Speaker, from the regulations on planning that the government brought in about onshore wind, where the government's actually said that in order for a proposal to go ahead, it has to be demonstrated the planning impacts identified by affected local communities have been fully addressed, and therefore the proposal has their backing. So onshore wind, the community can actually veto the proposals. On fracking, on exploratory applications, they won't get any say at all. And we looked at the issue of NSIP. You know, why? Why does the government want to do the changes? Why? Because the only answer we got was, well, probably councils are delaying consideration of applications. We had lots of evidence that showed that wasn't true, that MSIP was not going to speed up the process at all, and indeed we heard from Lancashire, where there would be complaints about the process taking a long time, that regularly in the process of considering the applications, and Regulation 22 had to be used 4 times, and the consultation had to be paused and started again because of extra information which the developer, the applicant, had to provide in response to questions from the public as part of the process. Not deliberate delay by the council, but delay as part of the proper consultation and consideration. What I would say to the Minister, he's new in this role since this consultation started. He never looked very comfortable when this matter is being discussed. I suspect he's coming to it with a new eye. Hopefully it is. Just listen to the weight of opinion across the House from his honourable friends as well as members on this side, and just say, whatever the merits of fracking per se, just look at these 2 proposals and see that they are a rollback from the localism and democratic agenda that we ought to be pursuing, and abandon them now.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's no doubt that shale gas exploration or fracking has caused great concern up and down the country. But what is also concerned is the feeling that the government are trying to move the goalposts to lock people out of being able to express their concerns. People from many different communities and indeed many different political perspectives have been united against this heavy-handed and undemocratic approach, including people in my own area. On the 18th of October last year, Labour, Conservative and independent councillors on Cheshire West and Chester Council voted unanimously to oppose the government's
approach on fracking. This cross-party consensus in communities up and down the country is building, so it is high time the government stop this dash for gas and listen to what communities are saying. By transferring responsibility for these decisions to permitted development or a centralised system, the government is in essence making it easier to apply for planning permission to carry out fracking than it is to apply for a two-storey side extension on a semi-detached house. Friends of the Earth have warned that the plans pervert the planning process and could make England's landscape a wild west for whatever cowboy wants to start drilling and digging up our countryside. The campaign to protect rural England call it an outright assault on local communities' ability to exercise their democratic rights in influencing fracking applications, and they add that it reads like a wish list from the fracking companies themselves. If we are truly going to take back control, we should have a genuine democratic procedure, not a stitch-up that benefits a few private interests. And we know the Prime Minister has said that our climate is the most precious thing that we can pass on to the next generation, and we would all agree with that. But how can those fine words possibly be consistent with these proposals? The Committee on Climate Change have stated categorically that supporting unconventional gas or oil extraction is incompatible with meeting our binding targets under the Climate Change Act. Now, we've spent months in here trapped in a Brexit mess of our own making, and while the impact of climate change both at home and abroad is happening around us, but are we so wrapped up in our own squabbles that we fail to fully appreciate the enormity of this? Last month, February, was so hot I walked around for several days in a T-shirt, which was very nice at the time. But actually, the Februaries I remember growing up in were pretty inhospitable. So whilst I was warmed by the rays of the sun, I was haunted by the thought that once again we were experiencing unseasonably warm weather. And then I thought about the constituent who told me about their daffodils arriving in December, the recent reports the world's insect population is declining rapidly, and the fact that places as nearby Spain have lost 1 million hectares to desert in recent years. So I fear when we put all that together, we are sleepwalking into a climate catastrophe, and that unless we really begin to face up to the fact that we need to shift away from carbon-producing energy sources, and we need to do it now, then we will be the last generation who enjoy the benefits of industrialisation, and it will be the next generation who suffer the consequences of our selfish inaction.
Great Davis.
As you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, shale gas is 95% methane, and according to the IPCC, methane is 85 times more powerful than carbon dioxide for global warming, although the government's kept to the 2013 figure of 36 times. So that means, given that fugitive emissions are 5%, fracking is almost twice as bad as coal for global warming. And NASA has shown another satellite imaging that basically the amount of methane has grown exponentially, having plateaued in the 1990s. So to fulfil our Paris commitments, we cannot go forward with fracking. But instead we see safeguards, we see tax incentives, and we see the displacement of renewables. We see the end of onshore wind, nothing much in terms of solar, not having Swansea Tidal Lagoon, etc. We should be having a completely different direction. And apart from the global warming issues, there's the issue of water. The Minister will know that millions of gallons of water with hundreds of toxic chemicals used as lubricants are pumped into the ground, and then half of it has to come back. Often it's carcinogenic or even radioactive. We simply haven't got the infrastructure to treat that water. We've got nowhere to put it as they do in the United States. Of course, President Bush bypassed the Clean Air and the Clean Water Directive to allow fracking, so you'd have a strategic gain over Saudi Arabia. We're not in a position to do that sort of thing. We can't deal with the lorries to transport the wide environmental infrastructure. When I was a member of the Council of Europe, I put forward a paper, the exploration and exploitation of non-conventional hydrocarbons, that was adopted then by France, and indeed the Macron government decided on that basis to abolish and not to continue with fracking. I've got a fracking bill now that I urge the Minister to look at that says minimally we should ensure that fugitive emissions are limited to overall 1% and 0.1% at the wellhead, with capping and no flaring. Our children are telling us about climate change. We should take that seriously. And finally, with the possible advent of Brexit, we may be in the hands of big multinationals using tribunals to fine us. If we don't, once we start fracking, if we withdraw the tax concessions, they'll fine us. So in the case of Lone Pine versus Canada, they charged the Canadian government hundreds of millions of dollars because Quebec had a moratorium on fracking. Similarly, Wales doesn't want to do any fracking, and if we go ahead with Brexit and we go ahead with the way we've planned with fracking, we'll be under the cosh of multinationals, as well as breaking our Paris commitments and ruining the future for our children.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to follow the honourable gentleman for Swansea West. For me, Madam Deputy Speaker, the context for this debate is quite simply the deeply worrying issue of climate change. Yeah. We face what is no less than a stark choice if we are to avoid extreme and potentially unstoppable change to the climate. And the choice is this: do we continue to develop and exploit fossil fuels, or do we leave them in the ground? It will be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to stop dangerous climate change if we do not leave fossil fuels, including gas, in the ground. Yet, we can and we must take a more responsible and sustainable approach. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is why we need to stop the exploitation of shale gas. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm conscious of time, so I also want to turn to the issue of local planning, which other members have spoken about today. There have been test wells in eastern Berkshire and other parts of the south east, as one of the honourable gentlemen opposite mentioned earlier. In Reading, Woodley and the Thames Valley, many residents have deep concerns about our local environment, and indeed in our area there is a long history of concerns about the effects of noise pollution and from major infrastructure projects such as the expansion of Heathrow and large-scale gravel extraction. The very last thing that residents in our part of England need is a major new environmental threat. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm again conscious of time, and I do want to just add my support to a range of other points made by other speakers today. In particular, I would like to support and endorse the concerns which have been made about the relative weakness of the planning system, and also, indeed, the government's policy on energy, in particular on renewable energy, and its deeply mistaken approach of cutting the feed-in tariff and, indeed, not investing in wind power, solar energy and other renewables like the Swansea Bay project for tidal power. I'm afraid I'm running out of time. And I should say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that these mistaken energy policies are in stark contrast to the policy of many other governments, including the last Labour government. So to conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have just 12 years left to dramatically reduce carbon emissions. Local communities around the country have very serious and substantial concerns about fracking. Given the climate crisis and the need for radical change in energy provision, given the undisputable concerns, shale gas exploitation has to stop, and it has to stop now.
Well, deprives. We hear a lot from some on the benefits of firing on with unconventional gas extraction, including, it seems rather surprisingly, from backbenchers from the Conservative Party today, and perhaps the government should be listening rather more closely to those voices in their own party about this issue. But there's we hear about the jobs it will create, the energy gap it will fill, and so on. There's really quite a Trump-esque glee with which these extravagant claims are made, and that seems somewhat at odds with the reality of what this messy, dirty process would offer. If the UK government wants to take an evidence-based approach, then they will also be forced to consider a little more seriously the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence supporting climate change. They must balance this fact against the rather weaker case to press down the accelerator in a rush to frack the English countryside. Now, it can be argued one way or another about the level of risks involved in the shale gas extraction process, such as the possibility of groundwater contamination or the danger of induced earthquakes. There are a lot of unknowns that need more research, and I don't wish to dwell on the points that have been made very ably by others. What we do know that these are genuine concerns because there are examples of it happening in places where fracking has been more rapidly pursued, leading to many countries like the Netherlands, for example, announcing plans to bring shale gas extraction to an end. And you have to ask why even citizens of the city of Denton in Texas, amongst the pioneers of fracking, have been trying to have it banned from their own backyards.
Well,
now,
honourable friend, please.
Yeah, very quickly, yes.
I'm opposed to fracking. The majority of my constituents are opposed to fracking, and we've heard the majority of MPs speaking today opposed to fracking. That's because of the concerns of their constituents, largely. Can she reflect on the position that my constituents are in, with the approach that the Scottish Government has taken, compared to the constituents of other colleagues across this House, and the approach that this UK Government has taken?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think all of us who represent Scottish constituencies are very pleased at the sort of much more cautious, evidence-based approach that the Scottish Government has been taking to this, and I would hope that the UK Government could learn from their example. Now, perhaps a more thorough regulatory regime will reduce the likelihood of some of the worst of these public health and safety hazards we've seen in the States and elsewhere, but frankly, I wouldn't trust this Government to make sure that those checks and balances are robust enough, and the rewards are simply not worth the risks. I hope care will be taken to properly address the public concerns that have been expressed across England. But again, listening to people is not a great strength of this government either. Instead, it seems the UK government is intent on slashing red tape and fast-tracking fracking through the planning process, bypassing local democracy and those pesky protesters who get in the way of things. I do not have a lot of faith that they will put public interest before that of big businesses. Now, even if it was established that fracking could be done safely, even if the considerable environmental impacts of this process could somehow be removed, no amount of regulation would prevent it from being a fresh new source of greenhouse gas emissions, and that is really not the way to go. You can disregard the evidence on climate change, deny its existence, look the other way, whistle a happy tune, but like all destructive diseases, the longer you leave it, the harder it becomes to fight. Climate change is the biggest man-made crisis this planet is facing, far bigger even than the Burach that is known as Brexit. These school children who took to the streets calling for action are right, and they deserve to be listened to. They are fed up with politicians carrying on as normal, people who are stuck in the past but who have the power to rob them of their futures. Now, it's undeniable we have a long way to go to move away from our reliance on oil and gas, both economically and in our lifestyle choices. Offshore gas will still play a role in the UK's energy mix for the foreseeable future, and I fully recognise the continued importance of the jobs that are currently dependent on the industry. But governments must pull together internationally to tackle climate change, and this will require us to move away from our fossil fuel dependence, not embrace new forms. Diving headfirst into onshore fracking explorations is completely the wrong direction for energy policy. And the good news is, though, that we don't need to desperately seek more gas under people's homes in order to keep on the lights. We have the onshore and offshore renewable technologies needed to establish a successful and sustainable energy industry. Scotland is leading the world in marine renewable energy and is very lucky to have a highly skilled workforce to deploy and the wind and the waves to be harnessed. With a quarter of Europe's tidal and offshore wind resources and 10% of its wave potential, this is where the unwavering focus for government support should be. Powers to issue and manage onshore oil and gas licences is devolved, and the debate over fracking takes on a very different flavour at Holyrood. There's a majority in the Scottish Parliament who oppose progressing fracking and underground gold gasification developments. The Scottish Government has conducted extensive research and continues to engage widely with the public on the issue. In the more than 60,000 responses, 99% were opposed to fracking. Now, my constituents in Edinburgh North and Leith, Madam Deputy Speaker, are not known to be shy of an opinion. They've told me how appalled they are at the thought of unconventional gas exploitation damaging our local shores. I agree with them, and I welcome the cautious, evidence-led and transparent approach taken by the Scottish Government to policy on this issue. I would urge the Minister to do the same and put an end to this damaging dash for gas.
Shadow Minister Roberta Blackman-Wood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to start by congratulating the Honourable Lady, the Member for Bath, for securing this really important debate. And I think it's been an excellent debate and one with a great degree of consensus across the chamber. Now, the government should accept that fracking is both dangerous and exacerbates global warming. In our opinion, fracking should never be allowed, and it certainly should not be approved via permitted development or the nationally significant infrastructure projects regime, rather than achieving local planning permission. Permitted development and the NSIP regime bypass both the local decision-making process and local people, and to propose such systems for fracking determination is absolutely reckless. With regard to permitted development, such is the madness of the government's approach that even their own MPs have said it is nothing short of irresponsible and downright bonkers. And the member for Fylde, who's currently in his place, speaks for just about everyone when he says, who on earth thinks that fracking is equivalent to putting a small extension on the side of your bungalow? Now, currently, the planning position is that those seeking to develop shale gas exploration need to secure full planning permission. Decisions must be made in line with the NPPF, and local planning authorities should have a section on mineral extraction in their local plan, and they need to follow the minerals section of the online planning practice guidance, because this guidance covers principal issues that mineral planning authorities should address, such as noise, dust, air quality, lighting, visual impact, and so on. It's not clear whether the impact on agriculture or safety or heritage or flooding or safeguarding land would be analysed or protected under the permitted development regime. While we recognise that there are exemptions to the proposed policy in terms of national parks, etc., we think that the intrusive nature of shale gas exploration means that wherever it is intended to be, it should have to go through the local planning permission system. Also, the consultation is not clear about exactly what conditions would be applied to shale gas exploration, as these will be outlined in legislation which obviously we haven't seen. So we think that fracking should not go ahead under permitted development with prior approval or not. And we are not alone. The government's approach to fracking has been criticised by almost everyone, apart from the fracking companies themselves and some on the opposite side. The Royal Town Planning Institute have said blanket permissions for shale gas exploration in England are completely unsuitable and fly in the face of good planning. And it has warned that the scale and sheer complexity of exploratory drilling dwarfs development covered by permitted development rights, ignoring the hugely sensitive local issues and environmental hazards associated with shale gas exploration. The government's consultation on permitted development for shale gas exploration closed in October 2018, as did the consultation on approving planning permission for fracking under the NSIP regime. So where are the government's responses to these? How long are we going to have to wait? Now, the NSIP regime, Madam Deputy Speaker, suffers from many of the same drawbacks as permitted development, and using the NSIP regime to give planning consent would also override the local planning process. The Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee have called on the government to ensure planning applications for fracking remain at the local level, as councils are best placed to understand their area. It was a point, I thought, excellently confirmed by my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield South East, the chair of the Select Committee earlier. We know that the vast majority of submissions were anti the government's approach. For example, Lancashire, Bolton, Brighton and Surrey are among councils who have opposed the permitted development change, and some have called the proposals an affront to democracy. The LGA responded to the government's consultation saying, we do not support proposals for a permitted development right for shale gas exploration. This will bypass the local democratic system. People living near fracking sites and who are most affected by them have a right to be heard. And my honourable friends for Sheffield, Healy and West Lancashire made that point excellently. A permitted right for shale gas exploration would fundamentally undermine the local planning process and stops councils consulting on issues that are relevant to fracking applications, such as the potential for seismic activity, and of course we know this has actually happened, water pollution, disposal of wastewater, well construction and well integrity, and water availability. These were points made very well by Honourable and Right Honourable members for Fyle, Arundel and South Downs, Preston, Surbiton, Thirsk and Malton and Ellesmere Port. These very serious areas of concern have simply not been addressed by the Government to date. So it's time for the Government to think again, not only about permitted development for fracking and using the NSIP regime for determination, but fracking itself. We know that Conservative plans to force through dangerous fracking would release CO2 equivalent to the life emissions of almost 300 million cars. It will hugely add to climate change and undermine the Paris Agreement, exactly what the Honourable Member for Swansea West and Reading East confirmed this afternoon. Community and environmental groups, including CPRE and Friends of the Earth, have fought back against these proposals, including taking the Government to court. But the Government have ploughed on regardless, including withdrawing support for safer sources of energy such as nuclear, tidal and onshore wind, points made excellently by the member for Wells and North East Derbyshire and Bristol West. In power, Madam Deputy Speaker, Labour will listen to the voices of communities across our country and ban fracking. Instead, we will invest in new renewables, end barriers to onshore wind and support new nuclear as part of a sustainable and secure energy mix. And we strongly urge the Government to reject both the NSIP regime and permitted development as routes to achieve consent for fracking.
Minister Kit Mulcahy.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you very much, and I congratulate the Honourable Lady for securing this debate. Shale 2, a repeat of the Westminster Hall debate, largely promoted by my honourable friend from North East Derbyshire. And it's clear from today that passions remain as high on this subject as they were on that heady afternoon. Now, I know the Honourable Lady wasn't trying to position herself as the sole custodian of our precious countryside, as a representative of a party that largely, overwhelmingly represents the British countryside. Obviously, this side of the House recognises the precious nature of our green and pleasant land. As an unapologetic environmentalist myself, I also share that view. Being genetically from Yorkshire, but brought up in the northwest and educated in the northeast, I also have the interests of the northern half of this country at heart, and now happily representing the same part of the same bulge of chalk as my right honourable friend from Arundel and South Downs, where I also have oil production that goes on unnoticed and uncomplained about by my constituents. This is a matter of extreme importance to me as well. And at the outset, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would emphasise that no final decision has been made on whether to bring these proposals forward. The consultations have now closed, and the Government is currently considering the representations made before issuing a response in due course. These consultations are part of a range of measures to make planning decisions faster and fairer for all those affected by new shale gas development, and to ensure that local communities are fully involved in the planning decisions that affect them. As Right Honourable and Honourable Members will also know, my remit as Housing Minister in relation to shale gas development is focused on planning policy and delivering the related manifesto commitments. As members have raised matters beyond my remit, including energy policy and reported seismic events, I will refer these, if the House doesn't mind, these matters to the Minister of State for Energy and Clean Growth for a response.
The Minister's talked about having faster applications. Could he explain precisely how that will be done, with the community being fully consulted about these matters? Because the Government, as I understand it, has done no impact assessment at all about their proposals. Does he intend to do one at any stage?
I'm coming on to exactly these issues, if the esteemed Chairman of the Select Committee will give me a moment. Now, moving on to the potential changes to permitted development rights. In the summer of 2018, we consulted on proposals about whether permitted development rights should be expanded to include shale gas exploration development, including the circumstances in which this might be appropriate. I'd like to make it clear that any potential permitted development right granted for shale gas exploration would not apply to hydraulic fracturing operations. It would also not apply to the production stage of shale gas extraction. Further, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I also emphasise that any permitted development right only covers the planning aspects of the development. It does not remove requirements under other regulatory regimes from 3 regulators: the Environment Agency, the Health and Safety Executive and the Oil and Gas Authority. It's important to note that all permitted development rights contain specific exemptions, conditions and restrictions to control and mitigate the impact of the development and to protect local amenity. Any potential permitted development right for shale gas exploration would be no exception to this. A right could include things like limits on the height of any structure, areas where a permitted development right would not apply, and noise and operation controls. The consultation sought views on this.
I'm very grateful to him giving way. Could he confirm whether permitted development rights would allow a producer to construct a well pad pretty much wherever they wanted to put it?
Well, one of the aspects of the consultation was to ask just exactly this question, whether there should be some kind of restriction. I know the honourable gentleman has submitted in the last debate whether there should be a density restriction on well pads within a particular area, as he referred to in his speech. And when we come back on the consultation, we will answer this question. Now, the permitted development consultation and indeed the NSIP consultation referred to by my honourable friend and the honourable lady on the other side ran for 14 weeks and closed on the 25th of October. The government is currently analysing the representations of the consultations and will publish a response in due course. Now, all honourable members have highlighted the importance of community engagement in the planning process, and I can reassure the House that we remain profoundly committed to ensuring that local communities are fully involved in planning decisions that affect them and making planning decisions faster and fairer. These are long-standing principles which I am adamant we will stick to. However, we do understand that communities feel they are often not consulted closely enough before planning applications are submitted by developers to the local planning authority. This can lead to opposition to developments and a longer application process. Engagement with communities at the pre-application stage gives local people an earlier say in the planning process and makes developers aware of issues of importance to the community that may need to be resolved. The planning system in the UK already provides an extensive legislative framework for community involvement. However, I believe there is scope to do more. That is why we published a separate consultation, unmentioned sadly this afternoon, on whether applicants should be required to conduct pre-application consultation with the local community prior to submitting a planning application for shale gas development. We believe this could further strengthen the role local people play in the planning process. This consultation closed on the 7th of January 2019, and we are currently analysing the representations that we've received and will publish a response in due course. We also welcome the HCLG's Select Committee report of its inquiry on planning guidance relating to hydraulic fracturing and shale exploration, which was published on the 5th of July, and we are considering the report and its conclusions and recommendations and will respond, in a well-used word in this House, shortly. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable members and everybody who's participated in what has been an interesting and fascinating debate this afternoon. Domestic onshore gas production, including shale gas, has the potential to play a major role in further securing our energy supplies. The UK must have safe and secure and affordable supplies of energy with carbon emission levels that are consistent with the carbon budgets defined in our Climate Change Act 2008 and our international obligations. The written ministerial statements on energy and planning policy made by the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and for HCLG on the 17th of May reiterated the government's view that there are potentially substantial benefits from safe and sustainable exploration and development of onshore shale gas resources. We remain expressly committed, though, to ensuring that local communities are fully involved in planning decisions that affect them and making planning decisions faster and fairer at the same time. We have also now delivered on our promise to consult on how best to develop our planning processes for both exploration and production of shale gas development, while ensuring communities remain fully involved. We are currently considering the responses from these consultations and will respond in due course.
Thank you. Vera Hobhouse.
Mr. Speaker, I thank all honourable members across the House for their powerful contribution in this very important debate. There is real anger across the board about the government's riding roughshod over local communities and not allowing local people a voice when it comes to gas shale exploration side. Across the board, there are concerns about the environmental impacts, particularly the industrialisation of the countryside, water contamination and seismic activity. But most of all, and I wish the Minister would listen, there is concern that fracked fuel is a fossil fuel and the government should entirely change direction, invest in renewables instead. Let's change direction, let's take some action on climate change, ditch fracking. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to the honourable lady. The question is as on the order paper. As many as are of that opinion say aye. As the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.